I am very proud of my Native American heritage and have dedicated many of my years to researching as much as I can about my grandparents and their amazing folklore and stories. Tons of incredible legends live and breathe. A lot of it is downright fascinating, but some is absolutely terrifying. Thankfully, I have yet to find anybody who has had real-life experiences with a Wendigo, and to be honest, I hope to hell that I never do. But another creature that has given me many sleepless nights after researching it is something called the PUKWUDGIE. Now, you might be asking, why would a tiny, mythical woodland spirit scare me so much? Well, the reason is that, unlike the Wendigo, I have a first-person encounter story, and the person who saw it was my grandfather. Now, my grandparents grew up on the res back before they moved into the city, where my mom was eventually born. My grandfather recalls spending hours as a kid playing in the beautiful surrounding woodland. It was much simpler times, and without the technology that is just second nature to children these days, they would have to entertain themselves for hours on end with nothing but the woods and sticks, sometimes building forts, sometimes playing hide-and-go-seek, and other times children would be left to explore the great outdoors, as it should be. Most kids, however, found themselves playing hide-and-go-seek. They'd split into teams and run off into the woods. My granddad held the record for being the longest, and he wasn't about to let that slide into somebody else's hands. Running as fast as he could, he managed to cover a surprising amount of ground before he could no longer hear the shouts of 99, 100, coming, ready or not. He'd ended up in a fairly densely covered area, and was happy it would take a while to be discovered. Backing into the undergrowth, he was almost entirely covered in foliage. Boy, was he happy, he tells me. One by one, he could hear the calls and shouts of others being found, and it was hard not to laugh or even call out with glee. He was well on his way to a new record. That was for sure. But that changed when he heard a noise. To start with, he naturally presumed he was about to be discovered by another kid. So, he crouched down even further, hoping they'd walk past him without spotting him. He could still hear the sounds of his buddies running and the occasional "gotcha" from afar, and he began to try and work out which of the voices from the seeking team he couldn't place. Once he heard all three calling to the others, he figured he must have been joined by a nosy rabbit, or something. He wasn't at all scared at this point, just hoped the critter didn't give him away. More snuffling and crunching followed, much to his annoyance. He had the perfect hiding spot, and was about to be outed by a rabbit. He was also doing his damnedest to not sneeze, despite not being able to see a flower anywhere. There was a really strong floral scent, which was making his nose itch like crazy. And that was when he saw him. Now, I need you to bear in mind something. My grandfather was, 1, just a small boy at the time, and 2, crouched on the floor. This him that appeared barely came up to his eye level, but being short was the only unusual thing about him. The small man appeared to be gray in color, and his back and the top of his head were covered in spikes, like a porcupine. He had beady little black eyes, a large bulbous nose, and a sinister grin on his large oversized mouth. And my granddad knew exactly what this ominous little creature was. A PUKWUDGIE. And he was petrified. You see, He had been told that if you ever encountered one of these creatures, you had to be extremely careful. If you made one wrong move and made them angry, they could and will kill you. And you wouldn't even be free after that tragedy. They would keep control of your spirit for an eternity. Needless to say, my granddad did what any terrified kid would do in that situation. He began to break down and cry. He was terrified, and just this mere presence would be enough for the creature to curse him. He burst into tears. He'll never know if that act was enough to appease this creature, that somehow, by displaying that level of fear and submersion, he had awarded the creature some sort of respect. But the little gray man looked at him. That awful grin, still plastered on his face, simply disappeared. Poof into the air, gone. Too frightened to move, my grandfather stayed there for another 10 minutes or so until his buddies found him. At first, they thought he must have been hurt. Discovering your friend, sobbing, with tears and snot all over your face, curled up on the floor was not what they were expecting. Having managed to calm him down enough to ascertain he wasn't physically injured, they took him home. Only in the sanctum of his own four walls did he finally feel brave enough to recount what exactly happened. His friends listened in awe, whilst his parents exchanged knowing and worried looks. Thankfully, nothing more came of the encounter, and he had not been cursed or attracted the creature to continue to play tricks on him. It took a long time for any of the kids to go back into those woods, but they never saw him again. I love listening to your stories, and I will bet you that most others tuning into this will have heard of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, you name it. But I wonder what they might make of my story, or you for that matter. In fact, it was actually around 5 years ago now that I was driving home from a long evening shift. You see, I had my own experience with something that I can't explain, and I think it was something other than a Sasquatch. It's very typical. These stories always seem to happen at night, with no one else around to verify it. But I guess that's why so many of these things exist and haven't been hunted to extinction yet. So, there I am, minding my own business and driving pretty fast, since there is barely any other cars on the road with me. I'm singing along to some rock tune on the radio, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel, headlights on full beam, as it's hella dark. I remember having to slow down as it had begun to rain. So, I hit the wipers on. Just because there was nobody else around didn't mean that I wanted to end up in a ditch. I cursed as the rain got heavier and heavier, because it was now making it even harder to see the damn road. To be fair, I'd driven this route so often, I could almost do it by memory. But you can never take the chance that a deer, or something larger, could take out your car and might just choose the exact moment to run out in front of you. And, as if by magic, that was exactly what happened. Only, if this was magic, it would be the black kind, with pentagrams and satanic vigils. I slammed on my brakes quickly, and how I didn't skid into it, I'll never know. Stopping distance in the heavy rain is a lot more than when my foot hit that pedal, that's for sure. The car came to a stop, literally, right in front of this thing. I say thing because there's no other accurate words to really describe this creature. At first, due to its size, I thought it must be a man. But despite this initial presumption, as the wipers cleared the windshield, and with the powerful headlights on full beam, I could clearly see whatever this thing was in no way, shape, or form a human being. Due to the dark and the artificial light from the car, I was unable to determine exactly what color its fur was. Yes, that's right. It was covered in fur, like that of a bear. But this was no bear. I think it was gray, but to be honest, it could have been a bluish hue. It was huge. Whilst I first, as I was careening towards it, it looked man-size, and now it was right in front of me. I could clearly see it was well over 6 feet, more like 7 or 8, if I had to guess, maybe more. Its head and face, well, again, it's hard to describe, as I am pretty sure my mind was desperately trying to rationalize all of it. But it looked like a wolf almost, resplendent with giant wolf-like teeth and bright yellow eyes. So, apart from the fact that there was a giant gray-blue bipedal wolf standing in front of my car, I hear your listeners shouting werewolf or dogman. Well, here's the kicker. Staring right at me, just when I thought I couldn't possibly be any more afraid, it, and I kid you not, this thing had wings. You heard me. This giant blue bipedal wolf-faced creature had wings that resembled that of a gargoyle, like what you'd see in movies. Bat-like, tears and holes in them. Disgusting. It stood its ground, staring at me through the windshield, just gawking, a blank expression. No, I didn't try anything. This thing just seemingly looked aggressive. I was afraid to make any move. So, I did the only thing that I could think of. I didn't try to run it over, but this thing, whatever I was looking at, looked strong enough to pick up the car, and I didn't think for one moment that I could harm it, even if I tried to. Knowing this creature, had I rammed my car into it, I'd probably only destroy the front of my vehicle. So, I rammed my hand down on the horn and blasted it over and over, hoping for the best. When you're in a state of immense fear and panic, well, your brain kind of goes haywire. And you know what? Startling it at the time seemed to do the job, as it gave me one stare, a malevolent look, and took off. I sat there for just a moment, trying to stop my hands from shaking, and then speeding off, burning whatever was left on my tires. At that moment, I didn't care about the wet roads. I just needed to haul out of there. Thankfully, I made it back in one piece, and you bet that I went straight to the fridge and downed a couple of beers. I'll never know exactly what I saw out there, but I can never forget its face. Its image, its entirety is forever burned in my mind. This is just a quick story that I'm sending you, but nevertheless, it is something that I will never forget. So please, hear me out. About 6 months ago, I was lying in bed one night, tossing and turning, and for some reason, unable to drift off to sleep. This wasn't wholly unusual when my husband, who is a cop, is on a late shift. So, I accepted that I was likely going to just lie there until I heard the key in the door. But at least I had one thing to keep me company while I waited: the baby monitor. The fact I could hear super cute gurgling from the baby and contented little snores from the toddler helped soothe me. It comforted me, even if I could not sleep when their daddy wasn't home. At least they could. As I was lying there listening, feeling thankful it was such a still night, as I could clearly hear both of them breathing, there was a sudden bang. Now, the toddler insists on sleeping surrounded by toys, so it isn't exactly unusual for them to start rolling off the bed during the nighttime, and the baby seemed to be used to it. I waited to see if there was a follow-up noise before I padded down to their room and risked disturbing their slumber. Nothing, and all was quiet, except their little cooing noises for a few minutes, and then a bang. This bang, though, was so loud that it caused all the lights on the monitor to shine. Still not concerned at this point, more like hoping to hell the toddler hadn't fallen out of bed, I headed into the room, still being quiet as a mouse. As I peered around the door, I could just make out their sleeping forms by the low beam emitted from their nightlight. Both were in bed, not that the baby could get out of the crib anyway, and both still fast asleep, although the toddler was making those that I am going to wake up mumbling sounds. I couldn't see anything on the floor when I heard the bang again. As I was now in the room, I could ascertain it was coming from the window. At this point, I was feeling a little unnerved, but more still hoping to God whatever it was didn't wake up both of my children. Tiptoeing over to the window, I moved the curtain slightly and peered out. What I saw next, I will never forget. Thank God I had closed the window that night, because the banging was caused by a hand. A large hairy hand, covered in what appeared to be thick, coarse, dark hair. Maybe it was fur. I couldn't exactly tell. And to be honest, I was so startled and frightened, I don't think it really mattered. I couldn't help myself. I screamed, and of course, woke up both the children, who began crying immediately. I grabbed them both and slammed the door, racing into my room and gathering them up close to me. I heard 3 more loud bangs on the window through the baby monitor. Then nothing. After their initial shock, both children soon fell back asleep. The toddler next to me and the baby fast asleep in my arms. That's how my husband found us, just a couple of hours later after he finished his shift. Being a police officer, he grabbed his flashlight and gun and made a very thorough check of the inside and outside of the property. Coming back inside, he made sure everything was locked up and suggested that I try and get some good earned rest. I am not entirely sure that he believed that I had seen a hairy, clawed hand scratching at the window, trying to get in. He is far more used to dealing with human monsters. Oh, and there's one more thing. We live in an apartment building, on the 8th floor, and there's nothing outside the window except air. So what the hell did we see exactly? I'll never know. I guess this story begins when I was out for my morning run. I came across a flyer stapled to one of the telephone poles that actually looked recent. Nobody really put things up on these old splintered posts, at least around here. It was the work of distraught parents that weren't content to let law enforcement handle things on their own. It was a notice of a missing little girl from our area, written very strangely. I saw the official missing poster at the post office. The writing, much more tame. I felt for the people involved. I honestly did. The distress they were in was palpable, even to me, and I had never even met the family. The child was something out of a storybook. Blonde hair and blue eyes, pictured in a set of pink overalls with a white heart in the center. Soon enough, though, I couldn't take 3 steps without seeing or hearing something related to the supposed kidnapping. I tried not to think about it while I was out for my morning jog. I don't mean to be cold. I just have to have a span of time where the world's poison isn't on my mind. So, when I came home later, I found something on my front doorstep. A large teddy bear. The kind that would never fit in a household washer. I looked it over, and there was no sign of who it came from, or where it came from. I just wondered if it had been delivered by mistake. I noticed that it was hardly new. It was old and didn't smell pleasant. I couldn't think of who hated me enough to cart a heavy, musty, plush teddy bear onto my front step. But a new thought chilled me. Did they know my morning routine and thus know when to drop the bear off when I wasn't around? Then, I speculated that I was being watched. It was a horrible feeling, and I brushed it off. So, I dragged the smelly thing out by the trash bin for the next morning pickup. 1 minute, the garbage truck was there. The next, it was gone. And so was the darn bear. I had uneasy dreams that night. Something dark had burrowed into my sleeping mind. I was dreaming about crying coming from somewhere inside the house, and I couldn't find it, no matter how I searched, and it was getting louder, and I was afraid that I would get the attention of the neighbors, leading them to suspect that I was guilty of something. I awoke in a cold sweat to find that the crying was indeed no dream. It was soft, but real, and very much so present. I couldn't find where it was coming from, and I fought back a tide of panic, telling myself that there had to have been some rational explanation. So, I walked into my bedroom for the 5th time and froze when I finally noticed the window. There was the bear, before me, staring in. I lost myself for a moment, the terror finally overriding all my senses. I thought to call the police, but what would I tell them? There was a bear in my window? The crying was coming from the bear. I steeled myself, thinking that this was one of those toys that recorded sounds and plays them back. Surely, this was just a trick. When I stepped outside with the bear, the crying had ceased completely. I was shaking, and it wasn't from the rain. I gave the bear a good frisking, and it did seem to have some weight inside of it that wasn't meant to be there. Maybe the make of the recording device that would tell me more. The bear was already cut open, the folds seamlessly pressing together. Something that smelled awful welled up into my face as I reached inside. The source was the decomposing body of a little girl who went missing, wearing the exact same pink overalls that I'd seen in the poster. Hi, I may not even be submitting this story to the right podcast. You seem to deal with all things monsters. I dealt with a real monster a few years back when I was only 8 years old. I'm 14 now. My mother loves thrift and resale shops. Whenever she goes, she has to take me along, for some reason. I get it, that cheap stuff is cool, but how much stuff does anybody really need? Just because it's cheap doesn't mean you have to buy it. But anyway, she gave me the usual line of it. If I go with her this time, she'll get me anything I wanted. I was 8. It wasn't like I could refuse and stay home by myself, which, in hindsight, would have been nice. So, I'm dragged to yet another resale shop. They more or less knew my mom by name there. She went straight for the clothes, while I found my way over to the toys. Something caught my eye. It was a magic 8-ball in the hands of a plush old-fashioned clown. To my delight, The clown was attached to an 8-ball by magnets. I had always wanted a magic 8-ball, and here I would get a cool clown doll along with it. For once, I was happy to be along for one of my mom's thrift binges. I played with the 8-ball often and put it back in the hands of the clown when I was done. In fact, I named him Herman. One night, I was having fun with the 8-ball rather late, asking it questions and shaking it under the covers by the light of my useless track phone. I froze in place when I heard some sort of shuffling in my room. It didn't sound like a full-grown person was around, but it didn't sound like an animal either. I couldn't place it, so I stayed under the covers and waited. I tried to lighten things up a bit, and I silently asked the 8-ball if the noise was Herman. It showed up as yes, definitely. I fought off a shiver and forced a smile. I again asked if it was Herman, and he was looking for me in particular. It repeated its previous answer. I asked if Herman knew where I was, and it said, very doubtful. Then, I asked what Herman wanted, since I knew it could only answer yes or no, or so I thought. It said, better not tell you now. And if you don't believe me, Google it. It's an actual answer on some makes of 8-balls. I began trembling, and I had to fight it off. I asked the 8-ball if Herman was going to hurt me, and it said, it is certain. No, this was getting far too strange. Surely it wouldn't answer the same question twice. I asked it, has Herman found me yet? And it answered, it is decidedly so. I threw off my covers so that I could turn on my bedroom light. When I did, I totally lost it, since Herman was sitting on the foot of my bed, but facing me where I was at the light switch. My parents came to my rescue. They naturally wrote the whole thing off as a bad dream, and I promptly threw away Herman and the 8-ball, and I never bothered to replace either one of them. Well, the story gets even more interesting as time had gone on. See, I kind of forgot about the whole Herman thing, until a few years later, I guess I found out that there was a rather large group of gypsies who had been donating many of the items and toys to that same thrift store that my mother went to. If you know anything about gypsies and their culture, they are heavily involved in, maybe not necessarily witchcraft, like black masses and killing children, but they do practice voodoo and magic to an extent. So, I almost wonder if maybe somehow, being around that culture, there was a demon that had found its way inside that Herman doll in traditional horror movie fashion. I don't know. That was real enough for me. What I dealt with inside that doll was a real living entity. What exactly was its purpose? I'm not sure, but it seemed intent on wanting to hurt me. Please excuse my lack of knowledge, which is why I'm coming to you with questions. Which I should ask you, if there is such a thing as a shadow cryptid. I call it that because I don't know what else to refer to it as. I had a very recent experience with one of these shadow cryptids, and it's just crazy enough to be worth sharing. So I checked into a cheap, single-story hotel during a business trip I was on. I was dog-tired, and staying on the road just wasn't an option if I wanted to survive. I was in bed, lights out, when I heard movement somewhere. It seemed to be where I had hung up my hat and coat next to the door. I thought that maybe a rat or something had gotten in my room and was going to chew holes in my good coat. Moonlight was now streaming in and throwing a huge white square on the just spot I suspected the sounds to be coming from. And I didn't see any rodents. But I did see movement. I shouted on instinct, "Hey!" A slithering shape withdrew and rose up to briefly take the shape of a person before melting into something like a pool of ink, and then finally snaking out of my room through the crack underneath the door. I pinched myself to make sure that I wasn't asleep and dreaming. I got up, and against my better judgment, to check out what I had just seen. Opening the hotel room door, I stepped into the hallway and looked around. I saw it, slithering there on the floor. It stretched out like a sheet of dried black rubber into the shape of a person, yet again. A single red eye blinked at me a few times. Once again, it collapsed into a puddle and began racing away very quickly. I couldn't tell you for all the money in the world why I decided to chase after it. I was more interested than terrified. It was just too crazy. And I probably sound crazy for not ducking back into my room and staying there. I chased it, but it had no trouble of staying ahead of me. Soon, I became winded, developed a side stitch, but I wasn't catching up. I also started to realize that the hallway seemed awfully long for a place that small. In the moonlight, I could easily read the numbers on the doors. They were repeating. By virtue of some nightmare law come true, I was running through the same repeating segment of hallway, over and over again. It was when I realized this that I think I heard some laughter from the shadow up ahead, except it sounded very deep in pitch and distorted, kind of like somebody playing a recording of a laughter, pitch shifted, and played through a loudspeaker. I gave up the chase before I fell over unconscious. The simple act of turning the opposite direction brought me right back to my room. I overslept, waking up way too late to depart on time properly. I don't know if this was a fever dream or what. I tried to dig up some information on beings called shadow people, but here, the resemblance is very marginal. I get sick when I come near small, single-story hotels that look like they could have a history. So, I'm sending this to you, in hopes you can maybe debunk what exactly I had an encounter with. Because I know, for sure, this wasn't a dream. I did come in contact with something evil. Hi. Me and my twin sister have a story for you about a living shadow that used to give us trouble. We're identical twins. She looks like me, and I look just like her. We were staying with my grandmother for an extended period due to fire damage to our house. My grandmother took care of us, while my mother and father saw to getting our home back and up and running as soon as possible, however long that would take. I don't even remember what woke me up at night, but I had come to just in time to see my sister floating through the air. I thought that surely grandmother was carrying her, and I just couldn't see her for some reason. When my sleeping sister floated across the open window, I could see that she was being held by some kind of being of shadow. I didn't think. I automatically yelled out at the thing to put my sister down and leave her alone. This thing, whatever it was, jumped as if it had honestly been startled. My sister landed on the foot of my bed and didn't awake from her sleep. I was worried that she was hurt, but she wasn't. She actually slept through the entire thing. I thought that was the end of that. Well, it wasn't. I dreamt the very next night about being a small infant and being in the arms of some adult that I could not see the face of. I felt warm and safe, and even drowsy, at least until I woke up. I wasn't in my bed. I was floating through the air, feeling a cold grasp around my body. I struggled and fought. I tried to scream but couldn't. Something chilly and strong covered my mouth. At last, I fell to the floor with a hard thud. Even though my heart was pounding, I could not think of anything else to do but find my way back to bed. This repeated every single night. I would wake up as I was being carried out of my bed by the shadow that tried to carry off my sister. I woke up a little later each time, and after about a week, I could tell that it was carrying me towards the cellar staircase at the far end of the house. I tried telling my grandmother about it, but she didn't seem to comprehend what I even spoke to her. I didn't know what to do. By stopping it from carrying off my sister, I must have angered it, since it only bothered with me from then on out. The night before our parents came to get us back for good, I had woken up just outside the cellar door at the bottom of the staircase. Mother and father weren't a minute too soon. I was okay, and I wasn't. I was fine, and I was traumatized. Thinking about the whole thing was like reflecting on a dream, and yet no dream ever made me shiver that much. I'm fairly certain this was some sort of poltergeist. Last winter, I did a coffee roast in class. It seemed like such a great idea at the time. Meeting new people, learning something new, getting to try my very own coffee. The course was held in London, near Ealing, in a kitchen at the top of a block of flats. It wasn't a bad location, but it was a pretty rundown building. I was attending with one of my girlfriends, and we were both very excited. It's been months since the class, but I still can't quite comprehend what happened. There are some days it doesn't feel real, like I'm living in somebody else's body. At times, it feels like someone has taken over my mind. Every day, things for me have become dark and tormenting. I can't look at children's play parks like I used to, for my innocence no longer exists. Life has become dark, wretched, scary, and even lonely. My arms are filled with icy fear coursing down my veins, and I'm constantly bumping into things and dropping things. I feel like a ticking time bomb, a myriad of stress that is heading at a rapid pace into what clearly feels like a brick wall. I used to be easygoing and airy, but lately, things have gotten worse. Ever since I saw what I saw at that class, the instructor, a Brazilian man who was very flirty with all the women, and even a bit inappropriate at times. What happened was he whispered into my ear that he needed a special favor. My stomach nodded, as I don't know what he was going to come out with. He then told me he needed me to go into the freezer and get some ice. I laughed, and he pointed me in the direction of the freezer, which was just down a corridor and next to the bathroom. It was an odd place for the freezer, and I realized that I couldn't hear any of the others in the class. So, I walked into the freezer and kept it ajar by pulling the fire extinguisher off the wall and setting it down. It was so cold. Go figure. I looked around for the bags of ice that Mario the instructor told me about. I spotted them and grabbed them and went to leave. When I closed the freezer door and put the fire extinguisher back onto the wall, I noticed a strange sound coming from one of the bedrooms. It was like a horrible grunting or groaning. Not the sound of what you would assume. It was like an animal. But there was no way this could be a domesticated pet. I've always loved animals, so I wasn't initially afraid, just curious. I continued standing there. A waft of something burning poured out into the corridor. It kind of resembled burning plastic or material. That was when I panicked, as I thought the entire place was on fire. I knew that I had no chance other to investigate, and that the owners wouldn't mind at all. I walked into what appeared to be the master bedroom, covered in blood, orange quilts, curtains, and carpet. There was an accompanying bathroom where I could hear grunts and groans, and even smoke. What the hell was going on? I threaded carefully into the bathroom, and my heart fell into my knees at the sight in front of me. It was a snake, writhing around in the bathtub, knocking over stuff, and the bathroom curtain was slightly on fire at the bottom. Only this was not a snake. This thing had two heads, one of each head of its body. It was a two-headed serpent of some kind, except again, not like you would think traditionally, but a head on each end. My mouth gaped open as I took in the horror of whatever this thing was. The creature was now gliding on the ground, up and down the bathroom poles. It was well over 8 feet. Its eyes, too, were orange and small. Little slits, which seemed to glimmer and dart around the room. I wondered what I should do. It was clearly a hazard having this animal in the house. I almost wondered if this was his pet and had escaped. Surely such a thing was a danger. I looked around and spotted an axe next to one of the fire alarms. I then contemplated about whether I should try and kill it. As if reading my thoughts, it looked over to me, dead in the eyes with both heads, and both heads opened their mouths, exposing an extremely large set of fangs and an opening where no doubt swallowed and it could devour its entire prey. It bolted towards me, and at that moment, I was able to step backwards and shut the door. I ran out of the room, back up the corridor, panting and utterly breathless. I looked backwards to see if the thing had managed to break out of the room and follow me. Thankfully, it had not. I did hear a thrashing and crashing sound, as if it was banging itself against the bathroom door, trying to get itself out. I had clearly aggravated the beast, and it did not like being disturbed. So, I managed to discreetly grab my coat and pulled my friend out before we went home, careful not to attract any attention. I had dropped the ice all over the bedroom. Mario texted me later that evening to see what happened, but I rang him back and told him all about the supposed snake. He then informed me that he didn't live at the property, but he went down to the freezer in the bedroom after and saw the ice scattered all over the ground. He then checked with the owners. They denied owning any pet, let alone a two-headed serpent. Mario then accused me of taking drugs in the freezer. My friends too thought I had lost my mind completely. Because the last year has been so crazy, I haven't really had time to fully process everything that has happened. Look, all I know is I saw something that was real, monstrous, savage, and clearly bizarre. I've booked into a counselor in hopes that they could shed some light on what happened. I have also looked into two-headed snakes online, but by our reports, the kind I saw only exist in mythology. I hope that my account can shed some light and hopefully attract some media attention, so maybe others who have had similar experiences can come forward and not being afraid of being cast off as crazy. Even though my story sounds hokey or even crazy by many, I stand by it firmly and will gladly tell anybody about what happened. Who knows? Maybe there truly are others out there who have seen the same things that I have. When I was just a kid, I constantly found myself at my grandmother's house. I was always staying there. She was such an angel, but unfortunately passed away back in 2014. Her house was surrounded by fields and stretches of land that seemed to go on for an eternity. This was rural Alabama, and we ran barefoot through the fields with not a care in the world. Looking back, it was such a special childhood, free from all the distractions, and very little access to screens or even technology. I felt as free as a bird on my grandmother's farm. But something happened as a child. Something disturbing, which I know I need to address as a grown woman. I believe that I encountered a real-life reptilian witch. I know I sound crazy, that if I give my name on this account, people will find me and think I have utterly lost my mind. But you don't understand. This memory has been stored in my mind and deep in my soul for well over 20 years now, and I feel like it's the time to discuss it. So, going back in time to the springtime of 1998, I want to say late April, or perhaps early May. I would have been around 9 years old. Grandmother's house was surrounded by large fields, as I said, and on this particular day, I was going down to the apple tree, as she wanted to bake us some apple pie. So, I was running down to the apple tree and climbed up on the branches. The apples were green, and as I took a big bite, they tasted of spring. I filled my basket and got ready to take them back to my grandmother's house. I heard a chirping behind me. It was the most bizarre thing. I turned around, but could see nothing. Then the chirping happened and started up again. I turned around. Still, nothing was there except the stretches of long green grass. When I turned back to grab my basket, there was a scaly hand touching one of the apples. It was green and scaly and snake-like. I shuddered and looked up. Before me was this god-awful demonic-looking thing. The only way I could describe it was skeletal, and it was wrapped in long black shawl. Whether it was a man or woman, I could not tell. Its eyes were open, bloodshot and yellow, fixed on me without blinking. The head was totally bald, showing scaly reptile-like skin and face, but almost like it was rotted away. There almost appeared to be little worms under its skin. The teeth were rotten and fang-like, and its skin was dark green to deathly pale. I tried to move back, but this creature, whatever it was fixed its hand on me, and seemed to almost rock back and forth as it attempted to pull me closer. I had no idea what it was going to do. Perhaps eat me, kill me, kidnap me. I had no idea. From the creature's head, 4 large purple horns shot up, and this creature continued to grab me and hold me with a viciousness and savagery. I closed my eyes and prepared myself to die. When it wanted me, I was not sure. The next thing I remember, it released its grip from me and retreated into the bushes before disappearing. My hands were bleeding, and I had a large wound. I looked up to the hill and could see my grandmother staring down at me. She ran to hold me. I began crying and started to explain to her what had happened. She told me she saw it all. We went back to her house, and she told me a very similar thing had happened when she was a little girl. It was deeply traumatic. She told me this, and she never quite got over it. Grandmother and I would talk about the incident for many years to come, right up until her passing. We both never veered that we saw something supernatural, demonic, and terrifying. At times, this creature still appears in my nightmares, and I wake up imagining its scaly hand locked over mine. I still have a car where it struck its force into my childish hands. I am writing this now, many years after the incident, and I hope that somebody else can come forward and tell me they have maybe seen something similar. At my grandmother's funeral, we also baked an apple pie in her honor. I went up to the attic and had the urge to look out at the old tree, now neglected with age. You wouldn't believe this, but I could have swore that I saw the same strange figure submerged at the bottom of the trunk. I just shuddered and walked away, not wanting to see any more, and hoping that I wasn't truly seeing the horrors of my past. I am lucky I survived. I hope that I can connect with anybody else who has seen something that they can't necessarily comprehend. I hope my description is thorough enough. Like I said, the best way for me to accurately paint it is it was half reptile, half human, but it looked dead and skeletal, with patches of flesh missing, and what appeared to be little bugs under its skin. It's like it was a living dead creature of some kind. It was terrifying. What happened to me as a child vividly lives on in my memory. I know it was real. It still reaps trauma into my everyday life, even as I write this.